out of the way. I would like to introduce Peter Frost, who's just told me to get out of the way. So.
Hi, well, good afternoon. I'm here to tell you why I'm short-sighted and wear glasses, and why I have the shape of a fledgling Hutton Shearwater. Right, where's me flicker? Well, over the last few years, I've had the task of sitting down and examining some 7,000 aerial photographs of different sorts of seabirds, ranging from northern royal albatross on the Chathams, and here's a more distant view, but that also includes the blue dots would be Buller's albatross, northern Bullers, king shags in the Marlborough Sounds, red-billed gulls, this one taken on, I think when he invited me to come and talk, he was expecting that I would talk about this flight that we did up through the eastern side of the North Island and down through the western side to Cairo and back again. But no, well, my attempt is really to try and generalize a little bit on some of the things that I've learned while spending endless hours, and I can assure you they're very endless, particularly when you have to examine these photographs and divide them up with lines like that, so that on subsequent photographs I am absolutely certain that I am not double counting and I am not missing anything. But while doing that, it gives you ample time to think about, why am I doing this? And, how can I do it better? And what are we learning from this? So here's one of the easier ones to do, gannets. Everybody loves gannets. They're big, they're white, and when they nest in this sort of situation, they're actually relatively easy to count. So I'm quite confident. You can never express absolute confidence in any count, as I'll tell you later. But I'm fairly confident that there are, 6,123 or something like that at Mahuki in that particular year. Nevertheless, if we get to Hinemoa in the Three Kings Islands, we're faced with this situation, and that's not the worst one. Have a look at Sugarloaf. And they're nesting in crevices, and they're nesting behind rocks, and it's fissured and broken up, and becomes a lot more difficult. In all cases, I would grid the areas that I count, and then go through each grid systematically, counting or dotting every bird that I would see that would be nesting at the time. Anyway, it's not an exercise in telling you how I go about counting, but just to point out that there are all sorts of potential sources of observer error and observer indecision that come into this. Here's an aerial photograph taken by Richard Robinson of a part of the white-fronted terns at Muriwai. And that looks okay because they're nice out in the open. And if I take my ground level photographs taken the day before, I can compare them, so I'm able to get at least some idea of error. In that case, Richard Robinson, photographing with a camera where every image was, I think, 35 megabytes or more in size, we can do it. But if you have anything less than that, they do tend to lose quite a lot of resolution, particularly for small things like terns. Anyway, why were we doing all of this stuff? Well, I think that when I was asked to do these, they were all from projects in which people were hoping that a system of long-term monitoring involving regular counts of seabirds breeding would give us some idea of what is happening with the populations. So let's have a look at a few results. Here are some results from earlier work and more recent work on the northern royal albatross on the Chatham Islands. There are 3 islands on which they nest, Motuhara, or Bertias, or 44s, and then Rangitutahi and Te Awanui, which is big sister and little sister, for those of you still in the old dictionary. So these were the counts that we've looked at recently, and they were not by myself. Barry Baker had also flown some earlier ones, and it had cost Doc such a lot of money that they thought, oh, well, Frost is sitting in Wanganui, which is a seabird capital of the world. We don't have a single bird that breeds other than black-backed gulls. So he's not doing anything, so he's cheaper, so we'll ask him to do the counting in future. Nevertheless, we got some reasonable counts. And I should point out that because it's a biennial breeding species, in other words, they breed only once every 2 years, other than a few rebreeders, so that represents the whole world population of royal albatross. So if you put it in the timeline of Chris Robertson and Paul Schofield and other work done in previous years, including ground counts, I should add there's some ground counts here as well done by Mike Bell, you would think to yourself, oh my God, the Royal Albatross population is in real problems because population is much lower, but in fact it isn't that much lower, at least for Rangitutahi and Tawanui. Although Motuhara, yes, the population is lower than it was in the 70s and much lower than it was in the 90s. But here, the population is recovering, or there was a big hurricane that came through, or typhoon, or whatever you want to call it, cyclone, that totally flattened the vegetation on these islands and stripped them bare. And that really caused a massive drop in breeding success. And maybe it is to some extent because those birds, the few birds that fledged there, are now coming into breeding age around here. So it could be that's an artifact. So to make the point, the broader general point is we're dealing with species that have extremely long lifespans, 30 to 40 to 50, perhaps in the case of Royal Albatrosses, maybe even 60 years old. They're very slow reproducing. And they have a very long juvenile period. I was talking to Biz about one of her birds that I've nicknamed Mary, simply because it was the first name that sprung to my mind, who first came and bred at 24 years old. Anyway, so when we're doing that, we do need these long time series. We need sustained commitment to doing them. It's very expensive, and therefore it's unlikely to be done unless we really improve the way we do some of these things. So that's one example. So let's have a look at another example, the king shags. Again, when you put all of the data together with the historical data, you find that our ability to determine trend in these kinds of data sets is really questionable. It could be that nothing's happening to the king shag population, and it is just bouncing around and is still relatively stable at its 900 or 600 pairs. But if something is happening, it's going to take us a devil of a long time to pick out what it is, given this sort of interannual variability in nesting. So we need to think a lot more about what it is that we're measuring and how we can properly interpret such data, and also how we can factor out as much as possible the observer errors to which I was alluding earlier. Just quickly to show Chris some of the work that came out of the 2017 flight. Here are the counts for the 2017 flight. Here are the counts for the gannets on the Three Kings Islands, actually on the Princess Group, in the Three Kings and Southeast Island there. And again, compared to the historical counts that we have, and these ones were set up with the aim of counting the population approximately every 20 years, in the hope that at 20-year intervals, surely something enough would have happened to tell us whether we need to take any management actions. Well, in the case of the Three Kings, they seem to increase, so everything seemed tickety-boo. And then I got a series of aerial photographs from Les Feasy up in Northland that he had taken that happened to include all the gannet colonies. So I set out and counted these. Some of them were quite blurry, but we came up with a figure that I have some confidence in it. Hey, presto, they seemed very low. And I thought, oh my God, gannet population is crashing. And at the same time, I was analyzing a set of photographs from White Island, which showed the same thing. So I wrote a report for Doc and said, it seems that the gannet numbers are really down, which was one of the stimuli for the 2017 flight. And as it turned out, 2017 flight showed that population wasn't quite as bad, although you might not think it. But if you add all of those together and you add all of the 1980s together, there's only about an 8% difference, 8% less in 2017. And I would consider that to be probably within margins of error if you consider that 37 years has passed between those two counts. That's the other problem. 37 years have passed. What's been taking place during that time? If we don't have ancillary information with which we can then match the changes that we're monitoring with what is happening in the wider environment or with the bird itself, we have very little opportunity to really say anything very significant about it.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
The
Yep.
To go back to your
Yep.
previous slide and the one,
Yeah.
are you counting, are those population of individuals
Aha, that's the point I'll come back. Numbers of nesting pairs.
nesting pairs?
Nesting pairs. In other words, what I've done is I've counted the number of active nests, birds incubating eggs, brooding small chicks, or with a large chick and a parent nearby, or sometimes, very occasionally, a large chick by itself, assuming that both parents are off at sea. And that's something I'll come back to later. What is it that we are counting and reporting? Because it's a very important point, and there's a lot of inconsistency in the reports as to exactly what it is. Is that okay? Yeah, fine. Okay. Now, one of the possibilities is that any drops that we're seeing could actually result from this movement, intercolony movement. And I think one of the earlier speakers, was it David, was saying that the idea that, you know, seabirds show strict fidelity has just gone out the window. We know that in many cases, not necessarily all, but for many species, that's not necessarily true. There is intercolony movement. Here's one good example from the back door of Auckland's back door. This is Ohio Island off the coast at Muriwai. And that was originally where the gannet population on the west coast, other than Karawa to the south, was concentrated. And then perhaps Graham Taylor suggests this because as the seal population began to bounce back, once sealing had finished, they started to clamber all over this rock and disturb the gannets. Some of them gradually moved on to Motuara, which is that rock pillar there. But that's fairly small, as you can see. And then eventually some began to move on to the mainland. But of course, at that stage, mainland still had cats and rats and people, and anybody could walk around there. So Auckland Council put up a fence, which was brilliant because the gannets suddenly started to expand. And then when they pushed the fence back and created more, the gannets continued to expand, and they've been expanding ever since, and well beyond the limits of what was possible, even on Ohio Island. But that shows that at least at a local level, there is some inter-colony movement. And that may account sometime, the question might be then, well, how do we account for these sorts of things where one year we get this number and the next year we get a much higher one? Is this just due to inefficiencies in counting? Well, of course, as I did both countings, and in fact they were both backed up by on-the-ground counts, and actually they were done from ground-level photographs, I would deny that there's any inefficiency in monitoring whatsoever. Of course, just not possible. Yes, well, that besides, just bear that in mind. Here's a different one. This shows the gannet colonies. Couldn't find any better way to represent this than a whole sort of LSD-induced series of lines on the map for the colonies in the inner Hauraki Gulf, and they bounce all over the place. A few things are obvious. The colony at Mahuki has increased dramatically, and that may be because there's been predator control on that island, and perhaps people, once the gannets really started to get going, people took more interest in them and provided some sort of added protection, and they seem to greatly increase. I'm not sure, I think there were still sheep grazing on that island, which actually for gannets is probably quite a good thing because they keep the vegetation open. The other one could be Horu Horu, which is this brown one here, which goes up and then goes down, and its numbers are quite down. But what's the long-term trend? Well, we only have these long-term counts from the aerial photographs 1946, 1969, and 1980. If I total up the whole of the inner Hauraki Gulf there with the whole of that there, comes out to very much the same sort of numbers. Okay, so that again suggests that the inner Hauraki Gulf gannet population hasn't really changed that much, if you believe those numbers, but there has been considerable redistribution of birds throughout those colony sites, which may be related to food, changes in food, changes in levels of disturbance, predation, whatever. We don't know. So one lesson from monitoring, if we don't back this up with ancillary environmental information, our ability to interpret numbers is very low, and in which case they just become numbers. Right, so while all of this was going on, we thought, well, maybe there are all these other data sets, and just look at them here, the classified summarized notes of the Ornithological Society, including OSNZ News, New Zealand Bird Report, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole lot of them. I won't read them out to you there. There were the nest record cards, and some of you will have, in your earlier days, assiduously filled in colony nest record cards and sometimes individual nest record cards for seabird species. So I got hold of those and went through those, still am for a couple of them, but I've done the white-fronted terns and the red-billed gulls completely, and there's not much for gannets other than Waghorn's work. And those were just selected nests. And the consequence of all that is that very little can be told from them, because partly of your point, and that is that numbers are reported. Gannets breeding at Muriwai, 200. 200 what? 200 birds were counted, 200 nests. You know, we don't know. And it's difficult now, so many years later, to go back and query people who perhaps have long passed on. What did your 200 mean? Even the nest record cards, which you assume would be accurate, sometimes run into exactly the same problem, because particularly if they don't fill in all of these little ones, which Richard Parrish did do, he actually gave the numbers here, and they just say nesting, and then they give an estimate there. We don't know if that estimate was the number of birds they saw. Sometimes they said, other times they didn't. So again, we're left with inconsistency. So my plea to you would be that if you are collecting numbers, try and indicate clearly what it is that you're reporting. Not all numbers are equal. Red-billed gull. So I helped coordinate the National Red-billed Gull Survey that we did through 2014-2016. Some of you may well have contributed to that. And again, it was an attempt to try and see what were the long-term trends, given that in 1965, Fred Kinski and Luger published a report which suggests there were 40,000 pairs of red-billed gulls in New Zealand. And when we went and documented as many of those colonies as we could only find just under 30,000, 27,500 or something around there. So again, the report went out, 30% decline in red-billed gull population. The reality is that when I then went back through Luger and Fred Kinski's data, it stretches way back into the boondocks, you know, the late 1880s, 1890s. So it clearly wasn't a current count. At the same time, the present survey that was, or the survey that was done then, didn't cover some of the outer islands, so that then was another reason for triggering that air survey. Nevertheless, I guess the only thing that I could conclude at the end of all of this was there did appear to have been some substantial decline in the frequency of very large colonies, over 1,000 pairs, and a proportional increase in the number of small colonies across various time periods. Sorry. Yep. Oh, sorry, that's what I was supposed to do. Yeah, here we are. Stupid me. It comes from forgetting. I'll go back through that again. Right, 1940s, 1960s. Okay, so that's the distribution. Not very many, so obviously not very many red-billed gulls, are there? And then 1970 to 1999, a few more. 2000 to 2019, many red-billed gull colonies. That doesn't mean to say that the numbers of colonies have changed. It just means to say our reporting rates and the diligence with which we reported numbers wasn't so great. And so that's the other thing, particularly if you're trying to get a picture of a whole population. You've either consistently got to monitor that whole population or some consistent subset of it. We can't do it just by collecting these data sets. I did get my glass of water. I live at home and I work all day, and I see my wife at about 6 o'clock in the evening when she comes back from teaching, and it's about the only human interaction I have. So excuse me for... Yeah, the life of a seabird biologist is sometimes lonely. It's not all this social stuff of going out and catching fluffy shearwaters. Anyway, right, let's go on. Let's have a look at white-fronted terns. So in white-fronted terns, again, you will remember there was this big push in the late 90s to document the distribution of white-fronted terns in New Zealand. So we find this pattern. We find that pre-1970s, oh yes, fair number, because they're quite spectacular things when you see a colony, and some of them were quite large. 1970 to 1999, which encompasses that period, great increase in the number of white-fronted tern colonies, at least reported white-fronted tern colonies. Not as many large ones, although there are a few up here in Papua Nui and the Kaipara. Sorry, damn water. And then if we go back to the present, we find that there are fewer ones reported, and funnily enough, they're all concentrated around here in the inner Hauraki Gulf, where there's a particular interest in what's happening to them. Again, the only pattern that I could draw out of this was that there'd been a systematic decline in the number of very large colonies and an increase in the number of relatively small colonies. Was this because people were now more aware of white-fronted terns and prepared to report any size colony that they found, or did it really reflect a real distribution of change in numbers? So let me just quickly finish off by having a few reflections. There are many uncertainties in using the historical data. Irregularity of measurement and uncertain, unclear units. It's actually logically impossible to know that you've counted every bird or every nest. So how do we apply any sort of confidence around our counts? One suggestion, I won't read it out, it's been suggested by Barry Baker and supported by some evidence that we can use 2 times the square root of the count as the confidence interval. What are the detection and interpretation errors? And I've given you there some that I've been trying to do, which is taking either my count and somebody else's count for the same birds. Mike, for example, and Dave were on Rangitatahi and Ta'awanui at the same time as the area photographs were being taken. I was not in the aircraft. Fortunately, I've never seen these islands, but boy, I know them like the back of my hand. I've looked at so many aerial photographs of them. And there's about a 1.82% overcount. And I suspect that that's on my part, misinterpreting a bird that I thought was incubating, which they know was actually sitting on an empty nest for whatever reason. If it was northern Buller's Mollymook for the same islands, it was about a 5% undercount. And in part, that's because my air photographs didn't go down far enough on the cliffs, and Buller's Mollymooks were nesting below that level. Simultaneous ground counts at Muriwai and of Australasian gannets and white-fronted terns coming from my ground photographs and the overflight the following day. And still, there is error. There's about a 2% error and a 1% error for the white-fronted terns. Funnily enough, that's less. I'd expected it to be more. And again, both counts have potential errors. They're still relatively small, so that's some level of confidence. And then looking at the 3 kings and the king shags, the red-billed gulls was much greater because very often it's difficult to tell whether that white blob is a feces-covered rock or the head of a well-sunken gull staring out to see what's happening with that thing flying past. Okay, and that's where most of that error comes from. And the king shags, Rob Shugart and myself counted the same set of photographs, and you wouldn't believe it, but we could not agree on certain things. So there are inconsistencies in things, and we should not forget observer error when we come to put these photographs together. And I think we've heard a lot today about the need to also account for, and I believe differentiate from these other sources of error, the environmental variation that may be driving changes in populations. And you've heard a lot about those today, so I won't. Just a few more reflections, and here I've got to be very careful. I've got to do this. Does this mouse work? Potentially, but can you flick it onto the white-faced storm petrel for me and then press it?
Oh, I can't. I don't know if I can do it. I can try.
Oh, well, that's fine, okay. Okay, so that first point was, do we need to count a whole colony, or can we be satisfied with counting some subsets? And here's a nice example, I think, although very limited, of what can be done, because we've got Buller's Mollymook nesting on Motuhara. There are about 19,000 pairs nesting on Motuhara, and they nest in hellish conditions to count. So I happened to, and I was charged with trying to count them. I said it's impossible, but I did come across 5 10 by 10 meter squares that had been set up in the 2000s by Paul Schofield and Chris Robertson. And so I managed to find on most of them their corner markers, marked those out and counted the birds in between. And then if I looked there, and Mike Bell had actually counted them on the ground a year or so earlier, and I counted them for 2017. And that gave us at least some indication that firstly, that was possible to do. Secondly, it might give us some indication of what was happening. There appeared to be some initial small decline, which may have fitted with other data. But generally, Buller's Mollymook seems to be quite good condition. And so I've spoken to Graham about the possibility of putting in more randomly located plots there. Oops, oh, I knew that was going to happen. Right, okay. And sample selection, does it need to be random or stratified random or some other thing? Can we do that again? Oh, yes, right. So we'll go with the Bullers, because this is significant, because this is now a nesting bird, and I've not talked about burrowing petrels. But if we look at Matt Rayner's study of 1 year, his attempt to estimate the Cook's petrel population, 3 different methods. One, simple extrapolation, just get an average burrow density on n number of plots and extrapolate that across the whole of the habitable space. If to subdivide those plots by habitat and then similarly extrapolate, or to use some sort of predictive model, which he reckoned was the most accurate and probably was, taking into account things like altitude, slope, and so forth, he came up with that figure. But my point is, look at those confidence intervals. They're substantial. So our ability to detect change over years is always going to be bedeviled by the fact that if you have very wide confidence intervals, and this was a very carefully done study in which presumably observer error was minimal, because they made great effort to ensure they got everything in, you're going to find it very difficult to detect that change. No, quick go back. This one. It's all very sexy, this thing here. Okay, so a few other things. Temporal frame. For how long do we need to continue monitoring these long-lived birds? They need to be kept, we need to keep monitoring them for at least as long as we're alive. And that presents problems because I'm no longer physically able to do that. Should we be using population indices? Is that going to be a better way? Well, it depends on what the index is and what question we're asking. What are the most meaningful sample units? And that comes back to the question I was asked earlier. You know, is it individuals, breeding pairs? What's the most variable thing in the colony? It's going to be individuals. What's the least variable thing? It, in principle, should be breeding pairs. And that's where I think we should be doing it. In fact, I prefer the term apparently occupied nests, because certainly if you're looking at them from the air, I can never be certain that that nest contains eggs or chicks. This is a point I really want to make, because it's come up a number of times today. We really need to institutionalize this. This is the first time I've been to this conference, and I've been astounded by what I've heard. I think there's such a lot of really good work. I'm coming, nearly finished. I can see you sneaking up on me. We really need to try and institutionalize this monitoring, because for such long-lived species, we've got to have monitoring that surpasses our own research lifetimes. Okay? And I believe that this conference is one way of initiating that process. If we can't put them all under the roof of some national seabird institute, which is unlikely to ever happen, then let's at least get together once a year and have not just a one-day workshop, perhaps 2, in which the second day is put aside to trying to sit around a table and trying to nut out collaboration, problems that people may be having to which other people may have answers, and so forth. That may be one way of doing it. So my plea to Auckland Council, thank you, would be, I think, one thing, because you're taking the lead by developing a 10-year plan, one way to further that would be to help continue to support and possibly sponsor a 2-day, one certainly, and possibly 2-day seabird symposium annually, in conjunction, obviously, with the Northern New Zealand Seabird Trust, who seem to have taken the bit between their teeth. And we can then begin to talk about things. What's the most cost-effective way of monitoring? And how do we handle all the data? I know people who have data sets that I can't get hold of. And I'm sure I've got data sets that they can't get hold of, partly because they haven't answered me or known that I've got them. So we really need to think about not just collecting the data, but using it and connecting with our resource managers and policymakers. So all of this depends on what questions we need to ask. And I'll end, whoops, no, I won't end there. I'm going to end here now, sorry, very sexy. Anyway, doing it, I'll end with Einstein's famous quote, and I think this is a really insightful point, is that not everything that counts can be counted, and I think we've heard today about many things that are difficult to count, but are really important. And not everything that can be counted counts. My own counts, for example. Thank you very much.